Good morning. This is lesson number 26. Excuse me, my computer just messed up. This is lesson number 26 from the book of Acts. We'll be in chapter 17, and this lecture will be regarding verses 1 through 15. Let me read for us out of the English Standard Version. Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, saying, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." And the people in the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing, as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. So we know that Paul has had his troubles in Philippi. He was put in jail and was miraculously released by the Lord, but then he was asked to leave the town by the magistrates, who were not happy with Paul for the things he had done, for the things he had said. But they also were being kind of held over a barrel by Paul because they had beat a Roman citizen and put him in jail. But after Paul had encouraged all of the men and women in Philippi, he did then leave and go on his way. And there's 2 cities which I have trouble pronouncing, Amphipolis and Apollonia. These are small villages that he went through. It would be on the route from Philippi to Thessalonica. Again, they are now in Macedonia. They are now in Europe, in Greece, basically proclaiming the gospel to a new group of people, mostly Greeks, mostly Gentile, but a few Jews who had been brought here through the dispersion from either the Babylonian captivity or from Rome occupying Jerusalem, or maybe even from just little persecutions that broke out. And people were going to where they could find employment and find a better life than what they had in occupied Palestine. Either way, Paul is going through these small villages, and it says he comes to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Not always did he find a synagogue. Remember, in Philippi, there was not a synagogue. He had to find people who were worshiping God out by the river on the Sabbath. Here he comes to Thessalonica, and there was a synagogue of the Jews. Now, what this normally means is that they had at least a dozen Jewish men who could form a synagogue, which is one of the requirements that they had. And so there's at least a dozen families who have come into Thessalonica, and they've set up a synagogue. And Paul, as was his custom, went first to the synagogue to debate with them and to share with them about Christ and how Christ fulfilled all the prophecies and was the Son of God and thus was the Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for. And it says he went in, as is his custom, on 3 Sabbath days. In other words, he was there at least 3 weeks by this time of this writing. And he has been in the synagogue on 3 Sabbaths, reckoning with them and explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. And he said, this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. And then we read that some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. Now, this is an interesting thing that said devout Greeks would be Greeks that were seeking to understand who Yahweh was. They were seeking to understand the God of the Jews. Just calling them devout meant that they were seeking after Yahweh. So they had most likely been at the synagogue on those 3 Sabbaths and been hearing Paul exclaim who Jesus was. And as the Jews who were part of that synagogue came to understand it and received them and were persuaded, so did a great many number of these devout Greek men. And then the tagline of, and many leading women. Remember that we have a different disposition of women in the European culture, in the Greek culture specifically, that they sometimes held power. Remember Lydia, the purveyor of purple goods, was a leading woman, and she was the first convert in Philippi. So these leading women, these Greek men, and these Jewish men and their families all have come to be persuaded as to who Christ was. But then we get the next little bit. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob and set the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out. It turns out that not all of the Jews were persuaded by Paul. Some of the Jews, most likely the religious leaders, most likely the rabbi of the synagogue, were not enamored with Paul and were not happy that he was proselytizing their people and that he was leading them, in their opinion, astray from the Jewish religion. And so they were jealous, which is the word that Luke has used throughout Acts to talk about what's going on with the Jewish leaders. They are jealous of the ability of these converted Jews who are now called Christians to be able to proselytize out of the synagogues and win over a great number of people to this new faith in Jesus Christ. They're upset because they didn't want to proclaim that Jesus was the Messiah. They know from all the words that they've heard from Jerusalem that this itinerant rabbi was not truly God's son, and that he had been put to death by the high council in Jerusalem. And so they're jealous. They're seeing these guys proselytize and steal people away from them. And frankly, I can understand a little bit of that jealousy of these religious people, because as a pastor, I can tell you when people leave the church and go to a different faith, let's say they go to Jehovah's Witnesses, or they decide to go back to the Catholic Church, or they go to a Mormon group, or they go to some other cult, we pastors sometimes get jealous that we're losing the people. But it can't be a righteous jealousy, because knowing that we are proclaiming the truth, we're not happy that they're being drawn away to a false teaching, to a false doctrine. Remember, we've been talking about Paul's letters to Ephesus and to Colossae, and talking about the Gnosticism that was going on in his time, meaning that there was teaching that was opposed to Jesus Christ. Well, if you're a pastor who was of the other side, you might be jealous of what's going on, that people are stealing your sheep. Now, it's not a good thing for a pastor to be jealous, but it happens. I know we've lost quite a few people from our congregation who have not gone to other faiths. They just have gone to other Southern Baptist churches. And that can be disheartening. You start to think, what am I doing wrong? You start to think, is the other pastor better than I am? Do I need to improve? When in essence, it could just be that people have moved and they're going to a church closer to home, or maybe they just think it's time for a change. And as long as they're going to a church where they're getting solid biblical teaching, I shouldn't be too upset. But I can understand jealousy coming into play. These Jews were jealous. And not only were they jealous, but it says that they took some of the rabble from the community. I love that word. They talked to some wicked men of the rabble, and they formed a mob. This is what's happened in all the places where Paul has been. A mob gets formed, and they start to persecute Paul. They start to attack him. And it just fulfills what Christ had said to Ananias, that you will tell him how much he will suffer for me. Everywhere he goes, he's caused antagonism. And here it is again. They have taken some wicked men of the rabble, and they have stirred up the crowds, and they have gone after him. But when they get to the house of Jason, where he has been staying, they discover that he is not there. They go through the house, they can't find him. They ask Jason where he is, and I suppose Jason tells them, I don't know. We aren't told that in the text, but it would be a good assumption. So they take Jason and some of the brothers who are in his house, and they drag them out in front of the city authorities. And they start shouting that these men have turned the world upside down. Now, the men they're truly talking about are Paul and Silas. They're not talking about Jason so much, but they tell the authorities, Jason here has taken them into his home, and he has received them. And these men are acting against the decrees of Caesar, for they're proclaiming that there is another king, and his name is Jesus. I can't disagree that they were most likely proclaiming that, but the understanding of these people is a little bit different. They aren't understanding that Paul and Silas aren't saying that the king in Rome is to be overthrown. They're just stating that God's Son, who is the king to fall in the line of David, has come. And yes, they might be proclaiming a new king, but they weren't specifically stirring the people up against Rome and against Caesar. But that's the charge that's brought here. And they attack Jason, they attack the men that are in his home, and they bring the charges to the city magistrates. We see here something that's interesting. It's the first occasion where we see someone posting bail, so to speak, because it says in verse 9, and when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let him go. So basically, they posted bail so that they wouldn't get thrown into jail, and they were allowed to go home, which is kind of interesting. The city magistrates maybe had heard from somebody who had come along from Philippi that there had been some issues with this Paul, and you need to be careful how you treat him. But they also acknowledge that Jason is not the one that the mob is after. He just happened to be housing them. And so all they do is they take some money from him to post bail for when he would return and hopefully bring Paul, I'm sure, back to them. But upon leaving, it says the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. Now that seems like a very simple statement. They sent them away by night. But you need to understand, in cultural speak, back in those days, nobody traveled at night. It was not safe to travel at night. You would not be able to see if there was somebody who was going to set upon you to rob you. You would not be able to see your way very well, and it just wasn't done that you traveled at night. People traveled during the day, and then they would set up camp and spend the night in one location and wait until sunup to travel again. But it adds to the point here that the men took the occasion to take Paul and get him out of the city at night and to send him off. Also, back in those days, you have to think about the fact that many cities had gates going into the city, and they would lock them at night. They would not let people in, they would not let people out. And so they had to get Paul out, surreptitiously, that's a hard word to say, by disguise, let's say, and they got him outside the city before the gates were closed, most likely, and then he traveled by night with some of the men down to Berea, he and Silas. And when they arrived in Berea, what did they do? They've now been chased out of at least two cities, Philippi and Thessalonica, and they've left behind people who are not happy with them. And they go down to Berea, and they don't flinch. They don't back away from preaching the Word of God. It says that immediately when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. That's just like Paul was always doing. But there's a great line here, verse 11. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. It's interesting that Luke uses the term that they were more noble. Noble people usually don't make rash decisions. Noble people usually hear out everything, and then they examine the documents to come up with the truth. And that's exactly what Luke says here. They listened with all eagerness, and then they set about the scriptures daily to see if these things were true. They were going to check things out, which is exactly what Paul would write later to people, saying, whenever you have teachers come in, check their doctrine. Make sure that they aren't false teachers. These noble Jews here in Berea were going to check out Paul and Silas and make sure that what they were stating lined up with prophets, lined up with the Old Testament scriptures they had. And in verse 12 it says, many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. We get back to this Greek women of high standing. It's something Luke keeps pointing out, and I think that that means it's an important thing for us to keep in mind because of the culture of where they are. But these people believed after checking the scriptures daily and making sure it was correct. And they had a bunch of Greeks, both men and women, who also believed. They are noble. They have checked things out. They know it's true. And there is nobody dissenting. They have all looked at it and have come to the same conclusion that what Paul and Silas are teaching is true. But then we get verse 13. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. It would seem that somebody from Berea must have traveled to Thessalonica, probably for business of some kind, And they made a claim about, hey, there's this new teaching that's happening in Berea by these two men, Paul and Silas, and it's really a cool teaching. It's really something you guys need to go and hear and take to heart. Not realizing that what he was saying was falling on ears of men who had been agitated before because they were jealous of Paul and Silas. So upon hearing that the word had come to Berea, these jealous Jews immediately traveled down to Berea because they had still been looking for Paul and Silas, and now they knew where they were. And so they show up, and when they show up there, they bring and agitate the people and stir up the crowds. Not the ones who had been hearing the word and who had agreed with it, but people who probably had no idea what was going on in their town. And these men came and probably made false claims, again stating that they are preaching another king other than Caesar, and they should be thrown in jail. They should be dealt with harshly because they are subjugating the rule of Caesar from Rome. And if you aren't careful, Rome is going to send a bunch of troops in here to clean things out. As they're stirring up the crowd and they're agitating, it says, then the brothers immediately sent Paul on his way to the sea. But Silas and Timothy remained there. So we see here that again, it's Paul who is the focus of the anger, of the jealousy of the Jews. It is Paul who had been doing most of the debating and teaching. He is the one who had the background and the knowledge and the skill and the intelligence to totally defeat those who he had come in contact with. And so they take Paul and they send him off. They don't want him to be attacked again and to cause problems. And so they sent him off to Athens because they want to get him out of town before these agitated crowds stir things up. And so it says they conducted Paul and brought him as far as Athens. But they left Silas and Timothy up in Berea, where they would continue to teach and encourage those who had come to the Lord. And when Paul got to Athens, it said, after receiving a command from Paul, those who had gone with him went back and told Silas and Timothy that Paul wanted them to come to him as soon as possible. He doesn't want them to shortchange the work they're doing, but he wants them to come and join him again. He wants his troop back. But here's what's really interesting. Through all this persecution, through all that's going on, Paul has been driven down to Athens. Athens is the seat of all the education that's happening in Greece. Athens is the seat of all of the major philosophers, all of the major historians, all of the major teachings. Athens is the hub of culture and education for all of Greece and for this part of Europe. It is going to prove to be a perfect place for Paul to come and be able to teach and reason with people who are probably as noble as those that were in Thessalonica or up in Berea, because they want to know about new teachings. They want to examine them. Paul is going to have a field day in Athens, and he's there mainly because the people of Berea drove him out and sent him down to Athens, where they felt that he would be safe. This is a great thing to have happen. Out of persecution comes great opportunity. That's something we need to see in our churches today. We find that out of great persecution in the third world, great opportunity arises. When the church is persecuted is when it typically grows the quickest. I think one of the reasons the church quit growing in England and the reason it's quit growing here in America is that we aren't persecuted. We aren't pestered. We're allowed to teach without any recourse. We're allowed to teach without any reprimands from the government or others. And thus we've become a little too complacent. And the church is not growing. We don't see the need as Christians to get out into our communities and tell people about Christ because we don't see that there's an immediacy of the harvest needing to be brought in. We need to get back to that point where we believe that the harvest is ripe and that the laborers are few, as Christ told us, and thus we need to send more laborers out into the field. We don't understand that our people today are dying without Christ, and we have the ability to share Christ with them. But we often don't do it because we just don't see an immediate need to go out and talk to people and proclaim the gospel. Yesterday, excuse me, somebody keeps trying to call and I didn't set the phone on quiet. What I was saying was we don't see the immediate need for people to get out into the community. And so that causes a lot of despair amongst us. We need to be more upright. We need to be more courageous. And we need to go out and share the gospel. And we need to be careful that we don't become so complacent that the church dies off in America because Christians have forgotten the need to share. I would ask that you would consider what you need to do. This was a short lesson this week, but I'll see you on Thursday night and we can talk more about what's happened with Paul and his group in Thessalonica and also Berea. God bless, and I'll see you Thursday night. Goodbye.